any introduction. Um, now we will see the talk by Rao, who is a former president of AAAI. He's a member of the HKI Board of Trustees, an ACM Fellow, a AAAS Fellow, and a researcher who contributed to the design of explainable AI before everyone else realized how cool it is. His connections to these workshops are abundant, and we can always count on his lab, Biochen, to regularly contribute quality papers. And we just can't have enough of him, so we also invited him to give an invited talk this year about human-aware AI for robots. So, Rao, please go ahead.
Okay, so you can hear me, right? So as I said, this is actually live. So if I get stuck in the middle, I might be having an actual stroke, not a video problem. So I wanted to talk to you about helping our robot overlords help us. So I have been mostly for most of my time in planning research. I've been working on actually generating plans, synthesizing plans in all sorts of scenarios, with different kinds of expressive models, different types of optimization metrics, different levels of model completeness. And I honestly haven't really spent that much time with plan recognition. I mean, I was of the opinion, I guess, that those who can plan and those who can't recognize. So Chris Greb is not here, so it's fine, I can say this. Things have changed for me when I started getting interested in human AI interaction, and in particular, human-aware AI systems and human-aware planning systems. And so, I gave a talk about this at AAAI. There's a magazine article on that. In general, I was trying to get a sense of what would be involved in trying to get AI systems to fluidly collaborate with the humans in the loop. So obviously, I don't necessarily have to say too much about why AI systems should be interacting with humans and why this is important. There are all sorts of areas, starting from the obvious ones like intelligent tutoring systems and social robotics. We basically actually need, even beyond that, pretty much anywhere people are interacting with AI decision systems, such as human-aware digital personal assistants, or office or hospital assistants. Are in teaming scenarios, you will wind up needing the kind of human AI interaction, and how can AI agents with their planning capabilities help humans. This is something that sort of caught on quite a bit now. There's several programs specifically looking at this. DARPA has ASSIST program as well as an ADAPT program, and I'm told there are more programs that are coming up. Apparently, everybody has discovered humans and want AI systems to work with humans. We'll talk about this a little later too. So this is a sort of thing that I was most got interested in. And I was particularly looking at what does it take for AI agent to show interpretable behavior in the presence of human agents. And my short, a sound bite is essentially, obviously, that they need to acquire and manage mental models. I mean, this crowd doesn't need particularly to be convinced of this. Social intelligence involves dealing with mental models, as you can see from as far back as the Salian test. And so this is the kind of direction that I've been looking at. We have bunches of papers in this, and we are even crazy enough to start writing a book on this. And the specific work that actually, there's like an overview talk of all these different efforts that we are involved in this, is actually a clean version of that. The most recent one that's available on the web is this talk I gave at the Samsung AI Forum. And that, if you are looking for something clean and well put together, that's the YouTube talk, the recorded version that you should be watching. In particular, it also has Korean subtitles. So, I guess it's always a good thing to have. But I won't do that. Instead, in this talk, what I thought I'll do, and is to sort of pair my work, with pairing rather, with HAI. So try to make connections to what we've been doing with plan recognition community. Obviously, we are all connected, but I thought I'll try to take a different look at much of what happens in human AI interaction from the perspective of plan recognition. Clearly, a solitary AI agent can be happy with planning and acting all by itself. It's a happy life, but once you start cohabiting with other agents, especially humans, whether to either assist or collaborate or avoid or deceive, you will wind up having to recognize the plans, goals, and intentions of those humans in the loop. That's for sure. I think most of you will agree with that already. But it's also, you, the AI agent, need to make it easier for the humans to recognize your plans, goals, and intentions. And that's like the second order thing, and that winds up being actually quite important. Um, and that's what sort of leads to the notions of interpretable behavior as well as providing explanations. And I'll try to get back to that. So my aim, in this talk is to put the body of our work in terms of model recognition, model following paradigm. And I'll get back that more details on that in a minute. And then that sort of brings out the direct connections to plan recognition a lot more clearly. I think some of you obviously, are already working in this area, but even others who just thought of plan recognition with no humans at all connected, or human interaction connected, might see more connections this way. I do want to say that this is a workshop talk. I kind of tried to make, Sarah and Ruth were asking, do I have like a video? And my fallback was to show a video of a talk that was done before, but I just can't do that, especially for you guys, who woke up and then showed up. So I sort of put together this talk by not doing anything the last week, but it is sort of not all, crisp and clean. So, hopefully that will lead to a lot of questions, but I just want to mention that. And before I go forward, I should basically point out that, much of this work that I'm talking about is done in the context of, my group. All these guys, some of them might be in the audience and they'll be cringing anyway, because I'll be mangling their work in trying to put it in some separate schema. But, so be it. So you get to see them here. So let's start with I guess what I'm trying to do is look at what we do in the context of this model recognition, model following paradigm. And let me walk you through that. So let's start with the tale of three models. So first of all, I want to mention that when I say model, obviously in planning community, a PDL model just typically is just the actions with preconditions and effects. But I take in this talk, as well as now work, the more general view that a model really is the initial state, the goal state, the action models, the observational models, and even the plan that the agent is trying to do. So any of these pieces, if you wind up recognizing them, that would be sort of model recognition. Keep that in the back of your mind. Given that, so the single agent planning that we all know and are happy with is clean enough. So if you have a robot, it has a model MR, and then it just basically uses of the model of the environment and its initial and goal states, and it uses that as well as its observation model to actually come up with a policy to go from, to reach the goals. That much we understand. Now, the problem comes when a human is put in the loop. When you put the human in the loop, then the first thing you need to look at is that the human might have their own model of the tasks to be performed. So they can have different goals. They might be in a different initial state. They might have actually different capabilities, different actions, and much work in plan recognition really has been focused on recognizing this M of H. So when the robot winds up recognizing M of H, it has some kind of an approximation of it. We can call it M of H R. And this M of H R can be used by the agent to anticipate human behavior in order to do a whole bunch of things, assist, avoid, team, etc. So we have done that, but there's also a large amount of work. In fact, the original idea of plan recognition came from this idea that if you know what people are trying to do, maybe you can use that to help them. So MHR is essentially the first of the interesting models that the robot has to recognize, the AI system has to recognize. So there is obvious clear-cut connection to plan recognition that I don't need to tell you guys. You all already know of that. The second interesting part is when humans are interacting with AI systems, they can't help but have models of the system in their own head. So in general, we always sort of assume this is the whole theory of mind idea that if they're actually working with an AI system, which seems to have reasonable capabilities, they will start having some approximate idea about what they think this robot's goals, intentions, as well as its observation model, as well as its actions are. So that is really MR of H. So this is the human sort of thinking, this is what the robot is capable of doing and is supposed to do. And the robot now, the AI system now has to, in addition to actually figuring out MHR, now has to recognize this MRH and not only recognize it, but needs to use it in, in making its behavior. In particular, when it has this MRH approximation, this allows the agent to anticipate human expectations in order to either conform to those expectations. So basically, if you just do what the humans expect according to the model they have of the AI system, then they are not surprised, they're not asked questions, everything is happy. In fact, I keep saying that if you do what the world expects you to do, you never have to open your mouth. Nobody would be surprised, and you never have to talk to anybody either. But on the other hand, conforming to expectations, either in real life for us or for AI systems, can actually be costly. And so instead, they would actually have to realize that when they do what is optimal for them, the humans would be surprised. And so they will have to explain their behavior in terms of the expectations that the humans have, and which typically winds up having to change MRH by communicating, how their idea of the capabilities of the robot or AI system are actually wrong. And these are the following changes that they'll have to make. So I think of this explanatory dialogue really as this communication part. So this is actually the sort of the more important slide. And in fact, it was supposed to animate, but for some reason it didn't. So let me just go through step by step. This is sort of the cycle that I want you to think of, and I will then talk about most of our work in terms of the pieces of this cycle. So a longitudinal human AI interaction cycle goes sort of like this approximately. The AI system starts with an initial estimate of MRH, what it thinks the human has, in addition to MHR, which I assume you all know that the robots are always supposed to recognize. And so this MRH, how to get that initial estimate, we'll talk later, but in general, sometimes it is provided as part of the common shared model. Sometimes the AI agent has to learn from existing behavior traces. And then the loop starts, as you interact, the AI system and the human are interacting. There's a phase where there's this model following phase, where in essence, you are conforming to people's expectations. And there's a model communication phase where you say, no, look, I'm sick of the model you have of me. I'm going to change your model of me. And in the model following come these several kinds of things. One, two of which you may have heard of is explicability that I will talk about here, which is do exactly the behavior human expects you to do given their MRH, given their model of you. And of course, the predictability is even if you don't do the full model, at least make your behavior conform locally to the expectations. So sort of make it predictable. A model communication, on the other hand, is you are trying to correct the MRH, you are trying to revise it, so that people, the human in the loop, will get a better sense of what actually your capabilities, your AI system's capabilities are. And this is where I would say you think in terms of legibility kind of ideas, which are essentially communicating the goal that I'm actually trying to go to. So I'm sort of signaling. Explanation, of course, is signaling, communicate the changes of the model. And then design, which is another way of communicating, is to sort of change the environment completely, such that given the environment, people will, the human in the loop will realize, it will have a better idea of the model that, of the AI system. In the context of explanations, for example, you could either do the heads up during the planning or post facto when people ask for that explanation. And in the context of design, again, of course, people like Sarah and Ruth are here. They've all been talking about this design. In fact, we have some work with Sarah. And the design can be hard, not in terms of hard in terms of it's very hard to do, but it can be hard coded into the environment, or it could be soft in the sense the AI system stops showing some behavior, some actions, just so that people will have a easier time of modeling it. And both of those are possible. So I'd like to think of what happens in this longitudinal human AI interaction cycle in terms of these pieces: model following, model communication, and then of course there's this beginning part about how to get an initial estimate. And so what I would like to do is, quickly try to put, pigeonhole the various pieces of work that we have done into this loop, starting from, of course, the explicability. That's where the arrow is showing. So again, in the case of explicability, what you're saying is that the robot's task model might be different from the human's expectation. So the consequence of it is that the plans that are optimal to the robot may not be so in human's expectation, so they'll become inexplicable. So of course, there are two options. One is confirm, and since we are in the confirm phase, that's the explicable planning. And the other is the communicate, which is the explanations that we'll talk right after that. Again, so I mostly went with the topics rather than examples, but here's one example that I wanted to show. So just so that we are on the somewhat of the same page. So think of this scenario where the human is a commander sitting in a remote location and the robot is on the ground. And in the beginning, they start with a shared model of the environment, the map of the environment. And essentially, then this robot is going around trying to maybe look for injured people or making its way through the environment. And of course, the human has the original map, but the robot actually is on the ground, so it knows what has changed, and so the map may actually have changed. So there's already a model difference. And so in this particular case, in the first example, what happens is that the human is expecting that the shortest path that the robot will take is a particular path. But it turns out that in this case, we put an obstacle there. And rather than just take the second shortest path, in this particular case, the robot decides to conform to the shared model, which involves actually doing additional work, such as removing the obstacle, and just so that you will get to the same place. So that's sort of what explicability goes. And as you can see, our poor Fetch was forced to pick up hard, heavy rubble. So in some sense, it would have been easier for it to take the second optimal path because this particular path has been closed. And so normally looking for explicable plans involves sort of a secondary objective for your optimization. Not only are you trying to minimize the cost of the plan that you're trying to find, but you're trying to minimize the distance between the plan you're finding and the plan that the human would have expected, given that they think you have MRH as your model. So in essence, you're trying to kind of figure out, this is sort of a multi-model planning. Not only are you trying to find a plan that's valid in the current model, but it's also closer to what would be an optimal plan in this magical model that the human has of you. And in fact, the magical model might be such that you can't actually exactly do the plan that the human expects you to do. In the previous example, if that particular obstacle is heavy and it cannot be lifted at all, then the robot is actually not going to be able to take the shortest path at all at that point of time. So the closest it would do is something nearby. So that's the explicability. The explanation is to say, to heck with it, I'm going to do what is actually better for me, and I'm going to communicate the model changes to the humans. And of course, when you're talking about model changes, the simplest thing is to try to say, here's my brain, take it. And then you will look at the world just like me. But obviously, that is way too costly from the cognitive load perspective for the humans in the loop. So you want to just communicate the minimal changes that they need to actually make to their model MRH of you, so that they will be able to make sense of your behavior. So in this particular case, again, if I can make this work, so it actually is taking a different path and it's yelling at the top of its head that that particular other path is actually closed, and so I'm taking a different path. So basically, it's just showing the piece that needs to be changed in the humans model so that they would understand it's new, that the best plan left is this other one. So so somebody's mic is on, if they might mute it. So the explanations as model reconciliation in this particular case. So the explanation process in essence is figuring out the small change epsilon that need to be made to MRH so that the human can then see your behavior as optimal, and then communicating that to the human. Okay, so that winds up being explanation itself is just changing others' mental model of you. That's what is the piece to keep in mind. And we talked about how this sort of explanations can be computed as a search in the space of models. And then depending on the way the search is actually conducted, you can wind up getting different kinds of explanations with different kinds of properties. And all that fun stuff comes there from in terms of computing as search in the space of explanations. The other thing that, more recently, I think last AAAI, we showed, I think Sharat and other people, including Christian Muse and of course Tadhagata, have this paper which basically shows that really you can combine explicability and explanation into like a single planning model, which is essentially sort of an epistemic planning model with expectation-aware planning, where you're trying to plan in the presence of external expectations, and MRH is really external expectations on your behavior. And so you can, and then you then have actions which not only have ontic effects, but also have epistemic effects. And some of these actions might be communicative, so they only have epistemic effects. And some of these actions are actually normal ontic actions, but also have epistemic effects. And if you use these together, both these expectations and your model together, then you can set up a single planning framework with the two models, MR and MRH, and such that the outcome of the planning process really is an explanation and a plan. Explanation essentially is communication actions, which are mostly trying to change the MRH. And once you add that explanation to MRH, then the plan that you came up with would be optimal with respect to that changed model. And pure explicable planning will essentially say that the explanation part is empty. So you can wind up picking how much you want to talk versus how much you want to essentially do just the plan without talking. It's actually an interesting question, as this sort of depends on what do you think is the cost of talking. And some people, and stereotypically it's been said, men don't like to talk much. And so for them, maybe they would just sort of lift big rocks rather than just point out the obvious that this particular path is closed. So it depends on sometimes, in fact, communication may be infeasible if it is one of Dave Smith's rovers, it might be, in a place where it actually cannot communicate right now. And so he's stuck with actually having to do explicable behavior. And so all of these can be put together in this nice framework, expectation-aware planning. Not surprisingly for this crowd, we do all these other plannings now by compiling it down to our happy single agent deterministic planning. So it turns out that under certain conditions, this expectation-aware planning can actually be compiled down to classical planning scenarios, and you can solve it that way. The other thing that I want to mention is the design part. So you can communicate. Remember, again, we're talking about model following and model communication. I didn't talk in the model communication about legibility work until now. I will talk a little later, but there's been legibility work in other groups, of course. And then we talked about explanation part and the design part. Here you're communicating the model by long-term modification to the environment or behavior. And the idea here in doing this long-term modification to the environment, the usual question is you're trying to trade off one-time design cost to the repetitive explicability cost. So every time, if you kind of make the environment change, then essentially you don't need to repeatedly compute this explicable plan, and sort of the environment model has already been communicated to the humans. The other interesting part about explicable behavior, especially with the humans in the loop, and this is sort of something that is known to you as humans, is when somebody starts doing something that you didn't expect, the first time you are surprised, the second time you are surprised, the 17th time you no longer are surprised, and when the 18th time, when they realize that they have all been doing this inexplicable thing the last 17 times and they start doing what you expect, you're again surprised because you've changed, during this time you have changed your model. Okay, so the expectation, the point is that the longitudinality of the explicable behavior is essentially sort of the cost of inexplicable behavior reduces. If you keep showing this inexplicable behavior, this is sort of what this Bernard Shaw's thing, that if unreasonable man, unreasonable person just expects the world to conform to them, and conform it will if you just keep doing your unreasonable thing. And so this longitudinality of explicable behavior has to be taken into account to actually figure out whether or not this design cost is worth doing. And so this is something that is actually, was in this paper in IRAS that Anaga is the lead author, Sarah and a whole bunch of us are also involved. So that's the design part. There is a paper in XAIP that Sriram mentioned last fall, which essentially does the same kind of design, but without having to actually make hardware changes to the environment. Instead, what it will do is essentially the robot sort of decides to minimize its model, reduce the complexity of its model, sort of reduce the branching points, etc., and stop, even though those options are available, it will just stop doing them. And so over a period of time, basically the humans will realize that this is a much simpler model. And so it sort of becomes, in essence, a soft design instead of hardware design. And it has some of the same effects in terms of making the communicating your model. One other thing, this is again another new piece of work that's still going on in the lab right now, is, as I said, explicability is something that it may not be needed if people get used to you. The other possibility is we don't expect explicability if we trust the agent. So there's this issue in longitudinal interaction. There's this additional latent variable, you can say, of a trust that the human has on the robot. And as the interactions continue, this trust variable improves. Perhaps, if you show what people are expecting you to do over a period of time, they increase their trust in you. And when they increase their trust sufficiently, you can start doing inexplicable stuff because they're not looking at what you're doing. And so, in fact, this is something that we do wind up doing in real life, and it's something that robots can do in terms of increase the trust people have so that you can then reduce the cost of showing the explicable behavior. So this is sort of an interesting way of course, again, when you do this, there is this aspect of deception involved, because what is to stop the robot from actually doing something completely, dangerous to the humans? But essentially, trust works that way. You increase the trust, then people will essentially leave you alone to some extent. And we actually look at this manipulation of trust as a meta reasoning process over individual planning tasks over a longer horizon. So that's sort of an interesting thing to look at too. And then I want to touch upon the initial estimate of MRH. How do you get that? I want to just quickly sort of point out the pieces of work that we have done and others have done that might be helpful there. As I said, in some cases, human and AI agent might start with the same shared model. That was the case in the USAR scenario, the search and rescue scenario. But even if the robot doesn't know the model with certainty, it might sometimes have multiple possible models. And you can then deal with multiple possible models and try to be explicable or provide multiple explanations that are consistent with multiple possible models. There is a paper in 2018 by Sharath on that. In other cases, if all else fails, then the agent has to actually learn the human mental models. This is sort of a variation of learning action models from traces. And so there is some work that we have done, and there's also a lot of work in the community about learning action models from traces. But there's also this other aspect that even though I want to think about this whole interaction between the human and the robot in terms of models, really you can do, once you think in terms of models, you can then do all of this in a model-free way without actually having to have explicit representations of models. And in fact, some of our earliest work in explicability, as well as the more recent work on explanations, actually do this in a model-free way, where you essentially represent the model. Instead of representing the model, you kind of get a surrogate in terms of what the humans would label these plans as, in terms of which parts of the plans are making sense to them, which parts are not making sense to them. And that's sort of an indirect measure of their model. And so you can use that to actually define the distance metric that we want. And you can use that distance metric then to actually come up with the explicable plan. So here you no longer are talking directly about the model. So this is sort of, it's a reasonable analog to this model-based versus model-free in RL. The word model makes a lot of sense in terms of semantically, but you don't necessarily have to represent it directly. You can actually get the surrogate for that. It turns out while we did that for explicability, we also actually in HKI 2019, Sharath has a paper which basically shows that you can even do explanations, model reconciliation in this model-free way, where the labeling is now done over not just actions, but actions plus explanatory messages. And I say this and this explanatory message, and look at you, see, do you look happy? So in fact, you can argue that kids sort of learn very quickly in their life that this magic word called sorry seems to get them out of all sorts of trouble. They throw everything around and then say, sorry, the mothers are happy. So that's an explanatory message that seems to work. So you could learn when to use what sort of explanatory messages from the traces too. And that's something that was discussed in this HKI paper. One other thing that actually I'm quite excited about, but I won't have too much time to talk about, is this sort of model-free methods also get you to think in terms of scenarios where the internal vocabulary that and the processing that the AI system uses are completely different from the ones that the humans are used to. Much of my talk, I said MRH and MRR PDL models, which is what we believe in because everybody thinks in terms of PDL models. But it may well be that the machine actually is doing some, opaque DRL, deep reinforcement reasoning, based reasoning. But the explanations will still have to be given in a terminology that the humans will understand. And so we then talk about this vocabulary translation of the explanations. This is something that's happening in the XAI community and for just a simple classification task. And Sharath has this very nice work that talks about how to use the symbolic approximation of opaque models to provide explanations. And that sort of connects to this vocabulary mismatch issue too. What else is missing? At this point, actually, so I have this longitudinal human AI interaction cycle, But I want to kind of mention some things that I'm not kind of glossing over. Communicating the model may not by itself guarantee interpretability unless the human has the inferential capacity to compute the optimal behavior from the model change. Okay, we tend to assume that everybody can do that, but obviously we also know that planning is piece-based complete. So why do we expect that normal people will be able to come up with optimal plans given the model changes? It turns out that one way you can get out of it is to actually make it an incremental file-based dialogue where you make changes to the model based on the questions that the humans are providing to you. I'll show something about that, but we've done a bunch of work on that. And then second part about interpretability is human is actually paying attention to the communication. You are telling human something, but if they're not paying attention, it doesn't go. It's not going to make any difference to them. And this communication first has to be perceivable. So the robot can actually reason whether or not it expects the human to be able to see what it is telling them, hear, see, perceive. So for example, if I'm talking to you on a radio without video and I start showing slides on the radio, the joke is on me, not on you, because I am completely missing the fact that you won't be able to see what I'm showing you. So I should be able to reason with your observational model. And that's something that Anaga's work actually gets into. I'll show one slide on that. And then, of course, there's a bigger piece, which is human is actually paying attention. That is, you need to get humans to pay attention. There's been a lot of work in HCI community, including some of the oldest work by Eric Horvitz and co, on how to manage humans' attention. If you just give too many updates, they'll just completely ignore all of them, and that winds up being an important issue. We don't do that much about human attention management as yet, but that is something, of course, part of this. And then finally, with respect to this longitudinal interaction cycle, you can say, how does the human figure out whether they are supposed to be in the conformation, whether the robot expects that it's in the conforming phase or it is in the communication phase. So is it in the conforming phase and it's showing inexplicable behavior, or it is in the communication phase and what you are thinking is inexplicable is signaling behavior. And it's trying to tell you that something is wrong with respect to, if you've seen enough Hollywood movies or spy thrillers, you know that the way you tell somebody something is wrong is to sort of change your default behavior that they expect of you. And when that happens, they know that something is wrong. And so it's in fact winds up becoming important as to how to capture this. And there's some work that we're doing that basically tries to put these, in a framework where essentially even this idea of whether it is in the conformance or communication phase is made part of an overall interpretability model using some Bayesian account of all of this. I'll very quickly just show, flash slides. I'm already running late. Actually, I'm probably beyond time. Handling inferential limitations with file-based explanation. There's a whole bunch of work that we have done, especially Sharath, where the files can be provided at different levels of abstraction, and the explanations showing the files don't work can also be provided at different levels of abstraction. The controlled observability planning, which is this issue that am I showing slides to people on a radio show, is something that Anaga has actually used quite a bit in trying to actually provide legibility as well as obfuscation at the same time, simultaneously. Legible to your friends and deceiving or obfuscating to your enemies at the same time. Sometimes that is actually possible. And that's where that observation model, of the model comes in, and you wind up, manipulating that. There's a AAAI 2019 paper on that. There's a very nice video of this robot trying to get Anaga's attention in one case and trying to kind of getting her to not look at what it's doing in another case. I would not show you, but it might be useful to look at it on my webpage later. And then finally, assistance. When you're trying to provide assistance too, some of the same issues happen. It's possible that you're trying to assist somebody, but they will not have any chance that they're not expecting assistance because it's proactive assistance. They didn't ask for it. And so the fact that you help them may not be recognized by them. And so once again, there too, you need to reason about the observability aspects. So some of the newer work that Anaga is looking at basically has this soundbite that proactive assistance should not only be provided, but it should be seen to be provided. And if I might give you like a thing that will stick in your mind, I have this story that I keep telling people of this couple who fought before going to sleep, and then they were angry and they went to sleep. And then the husband remembers that he needs to be woken up at 4 o'clock. So he leaves a note to the wife saying, please wake me up at 4 o'clock. He doesn't want to talk to her because they're angry. And then he wakes up at 8:30 in the morning, and there is a note saying it's 4 o'clock next to him. Okay, so that's basically essentially the wife clearly helped, and in that particular case, she helped to make sure that the help would not be perceived. But your robot can actually be doing it inadvertently, and you want to get out of that problem. And so that's a proactive assistance. There's also a demo that Karthik showed at AAAI, which is actually this. We do this assistance, decision support assistance in the context of land generation for mission planning people. And there we basically, this RadarX system not only takes, not only provides planning assistance and provides explanations about why it suggested a plan, but if the human were to provide a foil saying why not this other plan, it uses that foil as sort of an intimation that the human is expecting a different kind of plan, and sort of uses it a partial plan recognition techniques to come up with a newer suggestion that is more consistent with the foil. That's also sort of related. I won't go into this Bayesian account of measures of interpretability, but essentially this is this thing that we're trying to do to get this idea of how to convey whether you are in the conforming phase or the model change phase. And one piece that if I can get you to draw your attention to is that human-robot interaction requires open-world reasoning with regards to humans' beliefs about the robot. So you have to assume that there is this other model that human would have, that there's something that robot is doing something crazy, and the question is how much weight they will provide, probabilistic weight they will provide based on the behaviors that they have found. There's a whole bunch of extensions about this sort of stuff that I haven't really talked about. You can do much of this model reconciliation in the non-PDL settings. You can do look at other kinds of interpretable behavior formulations, as I already mentioned, foils. We can deal with multiple human agents, and then also, most importantly, trust and deception, and how to tell lies with this kind of explanations and so on. That you can also talk about, but I won't go into that. I want to end here and then say that what I try to do is essentially kind of give a way of looking at much of what we've been doing in terms of this one single longitudinal human AI interaction cycle, and then possibly put our part in pigeonholing our own work in this cycle. I'm hoping that you might be able to pigeonhole some of the other works also into that cycle. And then, so that's what my aim was, and I hope I succeeded to some level. And then I also, as a bonus, I left you with this thing about human X AI, that there's all sorts of human in the loop AI buzzwords that are floating about. And so here is a nice devil's dictionary of how to figure out the difference between human-like versus human-centered versus human-compatible versus human in the loop versus human-aware AI that you can have fun reading. Thank you for your attention. I will stop here and see if there's any time for questions.
Thank you, Rao. That was really fascinating. So we didn't want to stop you. We should now be about our break time, but I think we can steal a couple of minutes for questions if anyone wants to ask something.
Do you see that they are raised hands? Do you see them?
No, I don't see the raised hands. If you can see them, please go ahead.
Felipe and Wheeler, I think, right? Have questions, right? Just unmute yourself and if you.
I didn't raise my hand, but I have to just listen to everyone else. Or if I did, it was.
Oh, it was the clapping. I'm sorry. I thought that was hand raising.
This technology, I mean,
Yeah, no, my bad.
people
But
that work
yes,
in technology.
if someone has a questions, please,
So until
free.
people think of their questions, maybe something we had a very interesting discussion in the chat as well during the talk about the limitation of a bandwidth, especially when should you consider these limitations, especially when you work with humans? How does that affect, and specifically, how does that affect the planning component?
So the bandwidth being the communication bandwidth.
So I think we struggled a bit with the terminology,
Right.
whether.
So
Yeah.
let me then ask the question. So basically, you could in principle just throw as much information as you can at the human, right? And let the human try to make sense of that noise,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
basically, I mean, so that basically leads to a lot of cognitive load for the humans. I mean, that was the very first point that, explanation itself can be just take my brain. So, instead of your MRH, here is actual MR, just use it. And that would be a very costly explanation. It's actually extremely cheap for you to compute. It's extremely costly for the human to make sense of, and also somewhat costly to transfer depending on how bad the communication channel is. We are making the assumption that human cognitive load is the biggest cost we should consider. And so that's why we are thinking of smaller explanations where possible. And so that's sort of built into this. It's not just bandwidth, it is for them to make sense of the comprehending the explanation. And this is why I also talked about 2 points actually. One is in all of this work, basically we can't control the humans, right? We can, of course, we can train humans. I mean, experts, quote unquote, are trained to pay attention to all sorts of nonsense. That's what, if you're a non-Homer Simpson like nuclear reactor, engineer, you will look at all those billion lights. But the point is that most people's attention is actually very limited and they have other life going on. And so you should assume that you should say the least amount that would help them make sense of your action. And also, you also have to actually manage their attention in the right ways. And in all this work, the controllable variable is AI agents' behavior, because I don't quite know how to control the human agent's behavior other than by costly training beforehand.
Right. So I guess my point is that we have this problem everywhere in our life. Like there are lots of information, a huge amount of information that is there, and not everything is relevant, and not everything is relevant at that particular point. And there definitely some research needed on getting the right information to the right person at the right time. But what part of it is actually planning related?
No, I think first of all, the planning related part is we are actually able to tell which piece of the model needs to change. Remember that model space search that I talked about earlier? That is still the bedrock of much of this communication for us. And so we are trying to figure out what is the piece of the MRH that needs to change such that, at least in theory, the human can see your behavior to be optimal. So it is certainly planning related there, because what is relevant is certainly connected to what you are doing. Okay, and because it needs to justify your behavior in terms of their model. And so certainly it is very much planning related. The piece that we do is only about the planning related part, honestly. So that's the part that we count.
We had another question from Felipe.
Yeah, so also I think related to this discussion, but one of the things that I think we're discussing was what is kind of the baseline commonality in the model that the agents involved should have. Should they share like the same PDDL actions, which doesn't seem to be the case there, or should they share at least the same kind of space of predicates, the same state space? What do you think for this kind
of? So that is actually, so there are two different parts. One is, I think that's a very relevant question. So much of that talk, as I said, assumed that the models are sort of in, similar predicate language, etc. But that last one that I mentioned about vocabulary difference, which is actually a paper that's available, it sort of answers a lot of that question, which is basically saying that I can explain. So basically, if we can agree upon some common vocabulary that would make sense to you, some concepts that will make sense to you, then I can approximate my explanation in terms of those concepts. Would it be exact? Can it be probably correct? No, because essentially, this does lead to all sorts of interesting issues, such as, because in terms of the concepts we agreed upon, there is no simple explanation of what happened. But in many cases, there is an explanation in the concepts that we agreed upon, and so you will wind up translating that explanation into that vocabulary. And if you can do that, that would be the right thing to do. So in some sense, this is actually happening in the XAI. Let's understand what is happening in an opaque classifier sort of a scenario. Bean Kim and her co-workers essentially have actually sort of started this sort of an idea called TCAV, which is concept activation vectors. She calls it concept activation vectors, but really they're symbols, okay, agreed upon symbols. And so in some sense, in the old days, I removed all those other things. I have this bunch of slides contrasting this type of work about explainable agency to what has been happening in XAI machine learning community, which is mostly about pointing explanations, saliency regions. It's like if it's an image that you both are looking at, then I will sort of shade some parts of this image and say, these are the pieces that seem to be more relevant to my decision. And those actually make no sense. First of all, I keep saying that sort of flies in the face of civilization. The whole civilization, human civilization, was to go away from just pointing. There are many, many things for which you can't point to. For example, if you ask me, Rao, why did you come to give this talk from the office than from your home, which is basically about my plan that I used, I would need to point to this space-time tube if I'm going into the plan pointing path. That doesn't make any sense. And what they're doing in that case is, if the saliency region doesn't make sense, at least convert the saliency region approximately into the concepts that seem to be holding in that saliency region. As to how the concepts to saliency, the pixels mapping is decided, that is another learning phase. So you learn the translation and you use the translation to explain your explanations. And that, I think, is a pretty reasonable idea. So I have actually been involved in some discussion with this neurosymbolic AI panel, and I really believe that the whole point for symbols, honestly, is as this lingua franca. All this other stuff, is sort of questionable. But this idea that I understand some symbols, just like, this idea that machines don't need emotions, but they need to fake emotions if they're talking to you. Because as somebody said, Microsoft, the paperclip got thrown out because it had this smug look on its face whenever it comes up, and it comes up exactly when you are frustrated and you feel like punching it on the face, not taking its advice. That's basically saying that we expect emotional responses from people around us. Similarly, we expect symbolic means of communication. So two machines may never need symbols, but a machine talking to a human may very well need symbols. So my answer to this whole aspect of this, Hinton's symbols are but the luminiferous ether of AI is, they may be, but we need them, because if you are in the loop, you want to be able to understanding the explanations in terms of those. So that's like a very long-winded answer to, you will wind up, connecting the symbols to the explanations, when the vocabularies are really different. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, Rao. Shlomo, one last question. After that, we'll go to a break.
Sure. Hi, Rao. Any thoughts about Thomas Sandholm's suggestion in his invited talk to give up altogether on explaining certain things to people particularly when we deal with what he calls superhuman systems to play poker or to do supply chains or create schedules or plans that are so complicated that he found that at one point people's feedback and suggestions start being counterproductive, and their ability to understand the whole thing is limited.
Yeah, so that's that is a huge slippery slope that I completely expect Thomas to get on, because he's happy to slide down those kinds of slopes. He probably would also say we should cut out the emotions from the machines because those are problematic too. But the reality is that people expect explanations even when they don't understand. Okay, and B, deciding that you guys are not good enough to understand is going to lead to an AI-oriented authoritarianism, which I'm pretty sure Thomas has no problem with, but I'm very worried. Okay, so it's not like, because who is to say whether, I mean, it's like every potential authoritarian regime in the world says, we are doing this for your own good. Don't ask why we are doing it. You won't understand. You are too simplistic. Okay. And, our stupid superhuman AIs are extremely narrow right now. Okay. So they could very well be, imagine the following thing. If you take Feifei Li's example that she repeats about this machine that made the best chess move when the entire room was on fire. And you ask, why the heck did you do that? It will say, I'm a superhuman chess machine. You won't understand why. The reality is you are a stupid flexibility. Machine, we are like narrow superhumanness, but you have no connection to the rest of the world. And in fact, there should be, dialogues that we should be allowing in those cases, because a superhuman chess machine essentially killed the world, killed the room at any rate. So right. I think in general explanations, we have a whole bunch of work. In fact, I didn't talk about, explanations can be used to tell lies. Explanations can be used to bias people to believing certain kinds of things. The whole model reconciliation really, there is no real reason why I need to change your model to something closer to what I really have. I can make you believe in something completely different, not MR, but some M double dash. And that will just help me achieve my ends. And, I keep saying that some of the best Hollywood movies like The Sting, that you are old enough, Shlomo, to have seen, is about setting up this elaborate sting operation where they wind up believing a model that never was, just so that you would then be able to get them to do something. I understand that, but these are scenarios. All tools can be used. Every tool is a weapon. And the fact that because it can be a weapon, we should stop doing this stuff basically makes no sense to me. And so we do have to consider, there should be at least trust issue, for example, in terms of what would mean to allow people who don't understand narrow superhuman intelligence systems decisions to increase their trust. And at which point maybe they won't require explanations. But this idea that I know what I'm doing, and it's like the Jack Nicholson's, you can't have explanation because you can't handle explanation, makes no sense to me. Okay, so I think it makes sense to Thomas. I would completely believe that because I've heard him say this. I didn't hear this particular talk, but I've heard him say in other talks. But that just doesn't make any sense. Okay.
Thank you, Rao, and everyone. That was really fascinating, and we'll take a short break.
Hey, wait. Sorry, go ahead. Let me there. Good.
Great, thank you. So we'll be back in 15 minutes. Grab some coffee, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.